For most Canadians, the announcement barely registered. No breaking news banners, no emergency press conferences, no dramatic speeches from Parliament Hill. Just another diplomatic meeting, another trade discussion, another government statement buried beneath a mountain of headlines about tariffs, inflation, elections, and geopolitical tensions. But sometimes the most important stories are the ones nobody notices. Because while much of the world was focused on the latest developments in Washington, Ottawa may have quietly taken one of its most significant strategic steps in years. A step that could affect Canada's economy, Canada's energy future, its relationship with the United States, its competition with Russia, and perhaps most importantly, the livelihoods of thousands of workers in communities that have spent decades depending on industries now caught in the crossfire of global trade battles. The Canadian problem. Nobody could ignore anymore. For generations, Canada enjoyed what many countries would consider the ultimate economic advantage. A massive customer next door. The largest economy on Earth. A market willing to buy virtually everything Canada could produce. Oil, natural gas, steel, aluminum, lumber, automobiles, agricultural products. For decades, roughly 3/4 of Canadian exports flowed south into the United States. It became so normal that few people seriously questioned whether such dependence was healthy. Why would they? The system worked, until suddenly it didn't. When Washington began increasingly using tariffs as a strategic economic weapon, Canada's greatest advantage started looking like its greatest vulnerability. What had once been economic comfort became economic exposure. And exposure carries consequences. Not theoretical consequences, real ones. Factory shifts reduced, investments delayed, expansion projects cancelled, hiring frozen. Entire communities left wondering whether their economic future now depended on political decisions being made hundreds of miles away. The uncomfortable reality began to emerge. Canada wasn't merely trading heavily with the United States. Canada was dependent on the United States. And dependency always becomes dangerous when the relationship becomes unpredictable. Why Ottawa suddenly changed course. For years, politicians talked about diversification. Every government promised to reduce Canada's reliance on a single export market. Every administration spoke about opening new trade routes. Every economic report warned about concentration risk. But very little actually happened. Because talking about diversification is easy. Doing it is expensive, complicated, politically difficult. The American market was simply too convenient. Then tariffs changed the equation. Suddenly the cost of doing nothing became greater than the cost of change. That is the moment everything shifted. The threat was no longer hypothetical. The economic pain was arriving in real time. And once that happened, diversification stopped being a long-term aspiration and became an urgent national strategy. What we're seeing today is not a random collection of trade initiatives. It's a coordinated effort to redesign Canada's economic future. And one of the most fascinating examples may be unfolding thousands of kilometers away in Turkey. The meeting that most people missed. Recently, Canadian officials launched exploratory discussions aimed at expanding economic ties with Turkey. At first glance, this sounds like standard diplomatic business. Trade ministers meet all the time. Governments discuss economic partnerships constantly. Most of those conversations never become major stories. But this one contains something unusual. Something far bigger than trade, nuclear energy. Buried inside the discussions was a specific focus on Canada's world-famous CANDU reactor technology, and that changes everything. Because when nuclear reactors enter a conversation, we're no longer talking about ordinary trade. We're talking about decades-long strategic relationships. We're talking about national infrastructure. We're talking about billions upon billions of dollars. We're talking about geopolitical influence. And we're talking about industries capable of transforming regional economies. The secret weapon. Called CANDU, most Canadians have heard the term CANDU. Few fully understand its significance. CANDU reactors represent one of Canada's most successful technological exports. Developed in Canada and refined over decades, the technology has earned a reputation for reliability, flexibility, and strong safety credentials. Unlike many competing designs, CANDU reactors can operate using natural uranium. That feature alone makes them attractive to countries seeking energy independence. Today, dozens of CANDU reactors operate worldwide. The technology remains one of Canada's most valuable industrial assets. But here's the critical point. You don't simply sell a nuclear reactor. You sell an ecosystem. Engineering contracts, steel production, manufacturing, construction, financing, maintenance, technical services, training, supply chains, regulatory support. These relationships can last half a century. A successful reactor deal isn't merely an export transaction. It's a strategic partnership that can influence trade flows for generations. Why Turkey matters so much. Turkey occupies one of the most strategically important positions on Earth. It sits between Europe and Asia, between NATO and the Middle East, between energy producers and energy consumers. Few countries possess such geopolitical leverage, and Turkey has a growing problem. Energy demand. The country needs more electricity, more infrastructure, more long-term energy security. Historically, Russia filled much of that need. Through its state-owned nuclear giant Rosatom, Moscow became one of the world's dominant exporters of nuclear technology. Turkey's Akuyu nuclear project became a symbol of that relationship. But then the world changed. Russia's invasion of Ukraine altered the geopolitical landscape. Suddenly, many countries began asking difficult questions. What happens if your most critical infrastructure depends on a foreign power? What happens if political tensions escalate? What happens if your energy system becomes leverage? Those questions are now being asked across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, and that's creating opportunities for alternative suppliers, including Canada. The geopolitical opportunity Canada sees. This is where the story becomes truly fascinating. Canada isn't just trying to sell reactors. Canada is attempting to enter a market that Russia largely dominated for years. Think about that for a moment. A NATO country, offering an alternative to Russian nuclear technology. At a moment when governments around the world are actively searching for alternatives. That's not just business. That's strategy. That's influence. That's power. And if successful, it could reshape how Canada is viewed internationally. Instead of being seen primarily as a resource exporter, Canada could position itself as a provider of advanced energy infrastructure. The economic implications are enormous. The geopolitical implications may be even larger. Why this matters to Canadian workers. Now let's bring this back home. Because global strategy only matters if it improves lives. A nuclear project isn't built with press releases. It's built with steel, concrete, machinery, engineering, manufacturing, transportation, skilled labor, thousands of workers, thousands of suppliers, thousands of paychecks. When major infrastructure projects move forward, the benefits ripple through entire industrial ecosystems. Steel mills, machine shops, fabricators, construction firms, engineering companies, technology providers. Every reactor potentially represents years of economic activity. That's why this story matters. Because while politicians discuss trade policy and diplomats discuss strategic partnerships, workers are asking a much simpler question. Will there be work? Will there be investment? Will there be opportunity? A successful expansion of Canadian nuclear exports could help answer those questions. The bigger strategy. Emerging Turkey is not the entire story. It is one piece of a much larger puzzle. Canada is simultaneously exploring opportunities across multiple regions: South America, Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, Europe. The objective is becoming increasingly clear. Create alternatives, create options, create resilience. Because countries with options negotiate differently than countries without them. The more customers Canada develops, the less vulnerable it becomes to pressure from any single market. That doesn't mean abandoning the United States. Far from it. The American market will remain Canada's most important economic partner for the foreseeable future. But dependence and partnership are not the same thing. The goal is not separation. The goal is flexibility, and flexibility creates leverage. The three futures ahead. So where does this go from here? There are three realistic possibilities. Scenario 1. Nothing happens, the talks stall. Political priorities shift. Economic conditions change. The project joins the long list of ambitious initiatives that never become reality. This has happened before, and it could happen again. Scenario 2. A trade breakthrough. Negotiations accelerate. Political leaders commit resources. Formal agreements emerge. Trade expands. Investment follows. The relationship deepens gradually over time. Scenario 3. The nuclear catalyst. The reactor project advances. Financing falls into place. Construction commitments emerge. The sheer scale of the opportunity pulls the broader trade relationship forward. This is the highest impact outcome, and potentially the most transformative for Canadian industry. Final analysis. More than a trade story. At first glance, Canada-Turkey trade talks sound boring, technical, bureaucratic, easy to ignore. But beneath the surface lies a much larger story. A story about a country trying to reduce its economic vulnerability. A story about energy security. A story about competition with Russia. A story about the future of Canadian manufacturing. A story about whether Canada can successfully diversify before the next economic shock arrives. The truth is that Canada's future may not be decided by a single trade deal, a single tariff, or a single reactor project. It may be decided by whether the country can consistently build new economic relationships before old ones become unstable. Because in today's world, economic security is no longer just about what you produce. It's about who you can sell it to. And for the first time in decades, Canada appears determined to answer that question differently. The real question is this: is Canada witnessing the beginning of a historic economic transformation, or simply a temporary reaction to short-term pressure?